Hi, Rahul. Welcome to Part Mave and Part Maverick. I really enjoyed reading your book, To Raise the Fallen People, and your other book on Madhava Rao. And they really kind of represent the most important work of Indians writing to each other in English in 19th century India. But to kick it off, if someone's not heard of you or your work, why should they be listening to our conversation?
First of all, Ritavan, thank you so much for having me and having me on the show and for engaging with this work. And then directly to why someone should be interested and why someone should listen to us have this conversation. The books that I've published in recent years, and there's a series that are coming in the coming years ahead, all of them try in one way or the other to completely reverse what we think about the origins of Indian thinking and action. The standard story has been that Indians didn't think much before 1947, that they were oppressed, suppressed colonial subjects with a very limited voice. There were only a few individuals, a Nehru or a Gandhi or a Bose, that spoke for them and that acted for them, but that by and large they were oppressed and had no real independent ideas or thoughts of their own. And what my work in the archives and the resources that I've built and tried to make public, what they all try and do is to show Indians and show the world at large that Indians have actually been thinking about the problems of modernity, thinking about the problems of self government, of self rule, for more than 150 years before 1947. So the story of modern India really begins in the early 1800s and not in 1947, as most people think.
Yeah, and I think there was always sort of this gap where I guess until you sort of found all the primary sources that you did, people didn't kind of know what were Indians thinking, were they at all, etc., like you said. So can you kind of unpack the process you went through to like, how did you end up stumbling on this? Because I think a lot of this is primary sources that didn't really exist in the public sphere, right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so why these discoveries are important and why they are why they've had the impact they've had is because the sources themselves didn't exist in the past. So it's not just a new interpretation or a new reading or a new account. It's actually new from the bottom up. And I really got to this partly by serendipity and accident, partly by a lot of elbow grease. And I think so. I began with a puzzle, which was there seemed to be all sorts of inconsistencies in how India acted and how people thought. Indians thought. They would express Indian ideas or they would describe India's place in the world, for instance, as being influenced by Gandhi. But there was nothing in India's public policy or in its actions, whether it was the development of nuclear weapons or the willingness to wage war. Um, I grew up in the midst of or in the shadow of things like the Kargil War or India's intervention in Sri Lanka. And none of these things made any sense in relation to what people held up as the ideas that had shaped and influenced India. So this mismatch between India's actions, its public policies, liberalization, for instance, which was very much unlike anything Gandhi or indeed the socialists had argued for much of the 20th century. And so the question really that kind of scratched or that I wanted that was itching away was how do we explain these policies? Where have they come from? Are they entirely brand new? Are they merely the result of thinking since 1990? Is it the World Bank that's turned up, issued a set of recommendations, and then a handful of bureaucrats have just executed them? Even if that were true, what would explain society's wider acceptance and interest in these ideas? And so I began poking around in the archives. So I had a clear problem, but I didn't have an answer or a solution. And I started poking around the archives trying to figure out, were there other people that had thought about this stuff? And then in 2013, 2014, I had this sort of eureka moment when I stumbled upon a set of periodicals in the archives that revealed really rich, really important debates where they were all debating not just each other within the periodical, but debating each other across these periodicals, which indicated that there was a wider public sphere, that people were really engaging with ideas and had been thinking for a while. It wasn't just this one off, it wasn't one essay, which people will often do. They'll cherry pick a couple of items in history and then build a narrative out of it. That was not going to satisfy me. I needed to see something deep, rich, meaningful, and sustained. And when I found these first handful of periodicals, I thought to myself, so for example, there was one called the Indian Review, another called the Hindustan Review, and a third called the Modern Review. And I thought, well, this is it. And as I began actually looking at these periodicals, I realized, no, this is not it. This is just the cream on the top of a very, very deep vat. And these periodicals, which sort of dominated India's public life from 1900, 1901, that's when all three appeared about that time, till 1950 when all three disappeared. For those 50 years, these periodicals dominated, but it became really clear from the essays in them, from the editorials in them, that they were referring to things that had come before and things that existed alongside them that they were arguing. There was a Malabar Review, there was a Triveni, there was a economics bulletin, and I was like, where is this stuff? Like, who are they talking to? And as I began searching, and this is why all this stuff is so new, I realized that most of these periodicals had either been lost, damaged, destroyed, sold, pulped, and that the surviving copies were scattered around the world. You could find one in Buenos Aires, five in Tokyo, two in Moscow, three in London. And no one, if they stumbled across any one of these, would have reason to think that there was a wider universe because you'd seen one star in a constellation. So someone needed to actually rebuild the constellation to show people what the universe, not just any one thinker, not a Gandhi, not a Nehru, not this or that celebrity, not this or that public figure, religious figure, but actually show them the constellation. What did the whole world look like? Um, and so I was able, with a lot of luck and good fortune and wonderful sort of support from universities and funders, to raise a large sum of money that helped me collect these periodicals. So what we're talking about now, after 10 years of work, is about 500 periodicals scattered around the world, all of which have been collected, indexed. And what that in sum means is that there was something like 450,000 essays written by Indians between 1800 and 1950. Of course, this spanned a very wide array of subjects, everything from economics and trade, just statistics and numbers, through to very deep and abstract philosophical debates. But it spanned this entire universe, and I've tried to bring it back so that people can see what existed. And of course, even what I've done is only a fragment because it's everything that's in English. Well, maybe a fragment is underselling it. It's a very large piece because English is the primary language through which intellectuals express themselves, because it let them reach across the whole country. But there were also plenty of very important vernacular periodicals, which I haven't yet had the bandwidth to go after, but I will next. And you can imagine, even if those are about a third or about half the size of the English language literature, that's another 200 odd thousand essays sitting out there waiting for us to recover, which will only deepen and broaden our understanding of how Indians were thinking. So that's the source of it all, that discovery.
And I think what is even more marvelous, right, is that they're actually in English, which means that, you would think that in the 1800s, Indians probably not keen to speak or write to each other in English or think and discuss in English. But I think your work really shows that they very quickly sort of learned English and engaged in English with each other. And it's about, what do you say, 500,000 almost essays, and on a range of topics. And we'll sort of dig in deeper, but let's set the stage first, because I think it's very important to sort of know in what context this is happening. So it's the early 1800s where it gets started. The British have sort of finally managed to get a stronghold in India, and I think this is something that David Viviers has written about in The Great Defiance recently, where he actually shows how the British Empire wasn't just Vini Vidi Vici, it was a much harder slog over a century and more across the world. And so, long story short, the context is the British have finally sort of got their stronghold in India, and the Indians are having to, sort of, unlike a lot of other places that got colonized, the Indians didn't get wiped out. India is still around. It's the most populous country in the world. I think the third or fourth largest economy in the world today. And so there is a certain story of resilience, of comeback, of almost anti-fragility, of reacting to this shock. And you titled, so the To Raise a Fallen People, I think is you quoting Madhava Rao, where it's, there is this understanding like, oh, we lost our mojo and we need to get it back. And I think that is why this book is so fascinating. And that process, I think, also comes, sort of sheds light on a lot of strands of Indian foreign policy today, which is so relevant because the UN discussions recently, and you see the world is in a crazy churn right now. And in that sense, it's even more important to understand India's role, and India will and will play a larger role over time, just like China and a lot of other countries. The sort of American hegemony is sort of melting away. So yeah, I just want to quote Alexander Stubb, the president of Finland, who spoke very eloquently yesterday, and I think he said this in the context of Russia, but I think it applies to every country. He says nations that don't have a capacity to deal with their past, they have a very difficult time to look into the future. And with that, can you set the stage for like what is going on and in what setting?
No, thanks. That's it's a great line. And countries have convoluted or complicated histories. Sometimes they're histories of wounds, but also they're sometimes histories of unspoken or unrecognized accomplishments. And I think that's the thing that, either in your the way you set up the question, I think the objective of, especially to raise a fallen people, but the broader set of works that I've been bringing out, but specifically to raise a fallen people, is to show both the world, but particularly Indians themselves, to make them understand that they are far more. Indians have been far more pragmatic, adaptable, and resilient than they've often been led to think. They've been led to think um, that they succumb to colonialism easily, and the answer is no, exactly as you suggested. That they struggled all the way through to the end, and the British very nearly lost to the Marathas. The Third Anglo-Maratha War, in particular, was a very, very sorry. The first and second Anglo-Maratha wars were very close calls, and it's only the Third Anglo-Maratha War that actually leads the where the Marathas themselves fall apart in their and squabble amongst themselves and weaken themselves, that allows the British to really significantly establish themselves in the center of the country. And even then, there's a good third of the country that they never quite venture into because they realize their capacities are actually very limited and fragile and frail. So the both the tenacity of the Indians, their unwillingness to give in for decades, and then the fact that there are these pockets of resistance, the princely states or the native states, and the fact that Indians, even living in British India, very quickly, as you said, they pick up English. They don't approach conquest with a sense of defeatedness or a sense of resignation that now that we've been colonized, it's over for us. They think we've got to figure out how these guys managed to defeat us. There must be something wrong in our civilization, some weakness, some inadequacy, and we will fix it. We will repair it. We will change. And for them, hence that title, To Raise a Fallen People, the great failing or weakness has been in the areas of science and governance. There's an art to governing, and there's a science to engineering and so on that you need. You need to understand how modern warfare, modern weaponry works. You need to understand how modern trade and commerce work. But you also need to understand modern systems of taxation, government, rule of law, because these things are what make one organism, one state, more effective, more capable than another. And their defeat is not because they're immoral or because they're weak or because they're irreligious or because they're backwards. No, they're a great, proud civilization, but their failings have been entirely in this elements of knowledge of the change, and they have they have to come to grips with the changed world that's around them, this modern world, and they immediately begin doing there's barely a decade before this loss happens that they pick themselves up and dive in to demanding from the British, educate us in English, teach us science. And that's a great amount of gumption, and it's something that Indians should be incredibly proud of. And it shows us the resilience or tenacity of this civilization.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because I mean sometimes I feel so sad that a lot of Native American sort of civilizational wisdom has got sort of lost. But I always got the feeling, also reading some of the poems written by Native American chiefs about how they essentially argue, look, these are two different worldviews and we can't reconcile them, right? And I think that sort of also led to their destruction of sorts. And I think the interesting part with Indians, like you said, is within a decade they're like, okay, it looks like we need to fix stuff, we need to adapt, and we need to get into the game. And it also brings me to a recent discussion I had with Professor Doug Guthrie, who is a China expert. And he's essentially speaking about how China sort of, became this manufacturing powerhouse that it's today in the last 30 years with this mad curiosity and this mad hunger for let's get the best people from around the world, the best companies to set up shop here, and we learn from them. We learn that tacit knowledge. And to kind of but understand like that at India at that point is not like one uniform mass. You clearly write about how there is, how the Brits ruled India is important. So you say the native states, which is basically the Indian rulers that are ruling their own sort of provinces. So the native states were about 600,000 square kilometers, and the rest, the entire country is about 1,300, 1,380,000 kilometers. So it's slightly, the British basically are managing, are sort of, ruling directly over only about a half of the landmass. But interestingly, they're ruling over 80% of the population. And so is that because they're mainly on the coasts and they're like, because they're focused on the high density areas because they see leverage there and they don't want to manage the whole mass of land because it would stretch them too thin? I see you nod, so I'm guessing that's the right thesis. And the other thing that stood out from your work is it sounds as if British India is essentially like the British Indian government, its budget, etc., is essentially like the outsourced defense budget of Britain, where they're raising armies. So they're doing a whole bunch of stuff that's helping them as an empire, but it's not really designed to primarily, let's say, bring any benefit to India. And Indians very quickly seem to figure that out, especially with the opium trade, where they're essentially using revenues from the opium trade to fund their defense. And yeah, if you could just sort of explain, how did the British control military and foreign policy in these native states? How were the treaties between the British and the native states? Were they all uniform and the same? Was it like a franchise model like McDonald's, right, where they're essentially making the same deals with all these native states? So can you sort of unpack that? Like how did the Brits rule India?
Yeah, no, it's a big question, and I'll try and so I'll split it into two bits. One was sort of how did the British think about British India, and then how do they think about the native states, Indian India, as it was sometimes called. So when it came to British India, the story is actually a lot more complicated when you look at the personal correspondence, which has not actually been done enough. When you look at the personal correspondence of the viceroys, you see them struggling to manage Britain because Britain wants one, and Parliament wants all kinds of things from them. And even the Secretary of State for India, who's nominally their boss, wants all these things from them on behalf of Britain, which are impractical, dangerous, expensive, unwise, in India and in the surrounding context. And the classic case for that is Afghanistan, where or Central Asia broadly, what we today know of as the Great Game, where there are defense strategists sitting in London in these early versions of the first sort of big British think tanks, and they're agonizing over Russia. Will Russia expand into Eastern Europe? A very familiar argument. Things have not changed even 100, 200 years later. Will Russia expand into Eastern Europe? How do we manage? Russia's clearly heading south towards India. What do we do with that? Um, and this anxiety makes them issue all sorts of commands for things they want the British to do. For example, move up towards what was called the forward policy, move up towards Afghanistan, move up towards Central Asia to meet Russia on its way down so that Russia can't get to Afghanistan or get to the Indian borders. Because the worry was, if you were sitting in Britain, that the Russians would approach Afghanistan and then bribe the Afghans to invade India, and they can have the spoils of India. Because what the Russians really wanted was just to have the British unseated. They didn't want to actually govern India, but they wanted the British out because they recognized that was where Britain was drawing all of these rents and resources that was making Britain disproportionately powerful in Europe. So they wanted to cut the legs off the British Empire, or cut the heart out of the British Empire, maybe I should say, by getting the Afghans to do their dirty work. And the British are worrying about this, sitting in London, and they're issuing all these commands for what British India should do. And it's very expensive stuff. These are vast, wide open, arid terrains. They want them to build what are called strategical railroads. They want them to deploy troops, and troops are extremely expensive with very high death rates in those days. British troops suffer. They try and get the native states to provide troops, but they have limited capacities. They don't want the native states to be too powerful or to have large militaries in case they turn against the British. So they're giving all these commands, and the viceroy is sitting there hearing all this stuff coming from London with the newly established telegraph that's issuing commands on a daily basis. And then on the other hand, they're hearing from their officers and they're hearing from Indians about these sorts of things are unacceptable. You can't tax us to fight a war in Abyssinia or to fight a war in Iraq or to fight a war in Afghanistan and Central Asia. So the viceroys and their correspondence and the diplomatic correspondence from that era, which has not really been sufficiently studied, really reveals that the British governed India sort of almost by the seat of their pants. It was each viceroy was basically trying to keep the whole thing together, balancing these different demands that were being placed on them. The incredible, I mean, to the extent that one gives credit for this sort of thing, it shows you the incredible caliber of the people that were sent out, the caliber of the senior most officials, the viceroys, that they were able to take these very difficult, demanding, conflicting requirements, head out, expand eastwards to stop the French dominating Indochina, head out west to stop the Russians coming down, head out northeast to stop the Chinese controlling Tibet or the Japanese approaching. They were being basically asked to serve as the sword arm to protect this crown jewel of the empire, the source of all of its revenues. And so it was a very difficult job. So it's not so much that they were just executing what London wanted, but they had to balance and work out what was feasible and what was not. And so many of the most embarrassing defeats for the British were when they were trying, for example, when they went into Afghanistan and suffered defeat after defeat, um, was when they were trying to satisfy these large British concerns. And as Indians would warn them, you are thinking of yourself from Britain's point of view. If you think of how we in the subcontinent have thought about it, or how even the Mughal Empire thought about it, or previous empires thought about it, they didn't extend beyond this subcontinent landmass because it's just incredibly difficult to project power. Don't do it. And then the viceroys would still get pressured to do it. And so you see that the business of running British India, keeping it fiscally balanced, keeping its military active and energetic to deal with all of these challenges, was really a complex task. And it's not surprising that as wars approach, the First and the Second World War, basically show that this whole complicated enterprise is really hard to keep going. And it's war that weakens this empire, starting with the fall of Singapore and then the Second World War, which just shows this entire empire to be on a very thin footing. So that's one part of that question you asked. How was British India run? And the answer is precariously. It was never as easy as it seemed, or never as complete or confident to hold. And then the question was, how do they manage the native states? And that was also maybe less precarious, but quite a dance and quite a lot more difficult than many Indians recognize or realize when they think about it. They have this vision, one of two visions. Either they think of the native states as not really having said or done much. They just sort of sat there quietly living in their palaces with their dances and music and nach and, and jewels and finery and kind of screwing the poor peasant over. That's one account. And the other account is that they're sort of toadying up to the British, that they're constantly relying on the British to keep them in power, to help them suppress domestic and agrarian revolts, and they're really nothing more than little despots. Um,
There's even a third, right? There is one that says that we should have kept the Maharajas and they were amazing,
yeah,
etc. So, you really have such a spectrum of views. That's the vernacular view, or as you put it, right? The
yeah,
reverent
that's right.
view.
That's right. No, that's right. There is this third view, which is sort of I guess, a more contemporary view looking back, which
Mm.
has this sort of slightly rose tinted that these principalities were doing great, and then the British came and ruined everything. And of course, the immediate question is, if they were doing so great, why were the British able to outwit them or defeat them? And the answer is because the rulers of these principalities didn't have very well formed states. They were very primitive states with very limited capacities to manage internal conflicts, to raise tax revenues, to spend it in a responsible and efficient way, and to handle their diplomacy in a sort of organized fashion. not just to rely on a few favorites or a few.
Kind of rule of law, right, at scale, because you see
Exactly.
like the British, the East India Company being funded by Indian businessmen right early on. So clearly, they want some kind of they want a framework within which they can make money, right? I think that, and that didn't seem to be there from reading, work from that time.
Yes, yeah. So the 18 the from the 1750 to 1820 1830 period, that 70 75 years when the Mughal Empire is basically gone and you have these series of principalities rising and falling, is an incredibly destructive and painful time for citizens, for workers, or for individuals, for workers, and for capitalists, because you are constantly in danger of receiving an unwanted haircut, right? If someone comes and walks away with all your assets, or simply refuses to repay, or gets wiped out and can't repay. So the uncertainty of both taxation of especially loans and repayment make the banking class seek stability, and that's one of the things the British can offer them, and that's the power of the promissory note of the British is many interest on in terms of interest rates, many points lower than a Maharaja's. A Maharaja will have to pay 20% interest rate on a loan, and the British would have to pay 5. And the reason for that was just simply lower risk. The British would pay back a loan.
They always paid back, irrespective of,
And they
and
had this, one way when we think about sort of finance markets or interest rates is credibility, right? Long-term commitments and credibility. And it was the incapacity of these Indian princely states. They had, for many decades and centuries, worked out financial arrangements, but they relied heavily on a fairly stable political environment where there weren't risks, and a kind of easy relationship between the Mahajan, who was kind of lending the money, these small banking families who were very closely linked to the ruling clan. So you had stability within the ruling clan and stability within the banking families. But of course, the moment you get political turmoil, all of that gets messed up. And so, who will succeed? Who will survive? Internecine warfare is unclear. So you loan to one brother, but he dies, and the other brother wins and says, "I'm not paying that guy's debt back." Now you've got a huge problem on your hands. So you get this churn in the native states that absolutely kind of demolishes them. So this idea that the native states were functioning well just doesn't hold up, and which is why the Marathas, for instance, in the early part, in the 1760s, 1770s, 1780s, they are hammering the British because they've worked out their finances, they're modernizing their militaries, they're thinking about taxation, and they're trying to mimic and outwit the British. But once they start squabbling amongst themselves because they haven't yet worked out rule of law and worked out succession plans and worked out ways to coordinate their policies and their diplomacy and their fiscal policies, everything falls apart. So that rose-tinted view is wrong, but so are the other views, as I've been sort of alluding to already, that they're nothing more than collaborationists with the British, or that they're nothing more than sort of thoughtless zamindars who just basically are screwing over the peasantry. These are in fact really vibrant, vivid sort of places where the darbar, by no means do I want to suggest every Maharaja is sitting out there eagerly reading text and thinking about modernity. No, it's a small fraction of them, but all revolutions, intellectual and otherwise, begin with a small elite or a small group thinking hard and clearly about the circumstances they find themselves in, and the large principalities, Mysore, Travancore, Baroda, Indore, all of these principalities from the early 1800s, and even some of the Maratha principalities in the late 1700s, are thinking really hard about what's making the British succeed, and they're rapidly making efforts. They're recruiting French mercenaries, Portuguese cannon makers, Italian architects. These things are already happening by the 1780s. Forget the 1920s and 30s. 140 years before, these figures are engaging in a small cultural renaissance and revolution as they try and rethink their states. So we shouldn't think of the principalities as meaningless places, nor should we overestimate them. They were places of great ferment and experimentation. And so the British, your question was, how do the British deal with them? They had to be very careful in managing the more capable states, and not arousing their anger or having those local populations who look up to their rulers, who are clearly trying and striving, and therefore they have the respect of their populace, not alienating or hurting those rulers and provoking insurrections, which happen from time to time. For example, when the Travancore Rajas were being incredibly effective in attempting to reform their principalities, the British came in and squeezed them because they didn't want them to be too effective. The British came in and squeezed them and provoked one of the earliest rebellions. One of the earliest mutinies is in 1809 in Travancore, long before the 1857 mutiny. And it's because the Maharaja is basically trying to fight back against the British, and he's doing quite an interesting job of it. And has this incredibly powerful and capable Divan who's leading this charge. The Divan ends up being crucified. He's placed on a gibbet outside Travancore, outside Trivandrum, and the Maharaja dies of diarrhea, which produces all sorts of fears that he's basically been poisoned. And so the
Definitely been poisoned, right? It's like these people falling off windows and balconies in Russia today. It's like
yeah, there's a reason to think that. I mean, he has a medic that comes to him from the British and then proceeds to get diarrhea, which often is a side effect of arsenic sort of poisoning. So there is some reason to think that. And he's very young and healthy otherwise before this happens. So you get this insurrection in 1809. The British realize, hang on, we've got to be a little bit careful. So they are tentative in some states. They're particularly a large state like Hyderabad, where the Nizams are very powerful, wealthy, and have a population that's sort of fairly devoted to them. The British handle the Nizam or Kashmir with great care because they worry about this quote unquote, fanatic population as they see it, that would die for their nizam. Then they, or for their rulers, then they treat the large, the Barodas and the Travancores and the Mysores who are capable differently from smaller landlords and principalities with whom they take a slightly heavier hand. The thing that's common across them, you were asking this is a nice, interesting question about the franchise model. They have a similar, because they have to standardize their approach. They can't have of course, they give canon salutes of different orders. There's clearly precedence in ranking. Clearly, Mysore and Hyderabad deserve, because of their revenue and their size and their capacities, deserve a different treatment from something like Satara or Kutch. So they have a ranking in terms of honors and medals and prestige and so on. But because they are running a very tight ship in an administrative sense, they have to give similar um, arrangements, similar norms to all of them. So every state has a resident or a political agent. Every state engages in or signs a treaty that looks roughly the same. It says you can't engage in diplomatic relations with other native states or with foreign powers. You accept our political predominance. You will accept our advice when it's given. So there's these attempts to standardize the basic contours of the relationship. But what I've been trying to suggest is by no means is it completely uniform, because the states have such different capacities that the more capable ones are able to push back.
it sounds similar to a global corporation running subsidiaries. I think could that be because it was, the roots are the East India Company, right? Seems like, you want to give some level of autonomy, but at the same time, you want to control the important stuff, defense, foreign policy, etc.
Yes. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and I think what that highlights is, and that comes out beautiful in your work, is you have British India, which is the Brits running stuff directly, and you have the native states, or Indian India as they call it. And there are some interesting remarks where Indians are writing about themselves in English. And something that stood out to me was this comment around a lasting divide between the vernacular and the English, and the vernacular being more reverent, more traditional, and the English being more radical and more sort of forward looking. And I think that's a pressure that's still there today. I mean, I see that within my family, right? There are wings, let's say parts that are more, more radical, more forward looking, more, yeah, change more, and others that, look more to the past and try to draw inspiration there. And I think this is a very lived reality I feel in India. And there is then Narayan Dar who says the India is made up of these two things, that where there is one sighing for the unreturning past and the other pushing forward to realize the dim and distant future. And he's writing this in 1886, and it just so well captures this dichotomy, which lives today. And I think that's why a lot of people, when they look at India as like one homogeneous structure, even from a foreign policy perspective, it's absurd because you actually have all these trains. And this is something I wanted to sort of get your point of view on, because you've written your second book on Madhava Rao, who was like an administrator, a prime minister of sorts of different princely states, and he's one of the early ones to be British educated in Madras, and he says, he writes that science in India is sort of codified in Sanskrit. It has got ossified into formulas, and that he clearly seems to prefer more empirical, more lived, and more experimental science. He says, like the Indian approach is to focus on demonstrated truths that have been sort of, written down and passed from generation to generation, instead of constantly challenging and empirically verifying that knowledge in the real world. The knowledge is very revealed, right? And it's in Sanskrit verses. And now in the context of, I think, what Dalrymple's also written about how the Indian numerals, had kind of really triggered the Renaissance in many ways, and the Roman numerals were actually holding back science development in Europe. Do you, like, from your understanding and your reading, would you think that the fact that science was written in Sanskrit verse was probably holding back the development of science in some ways? Because it's difficult to write theorems to discuss and without modern formulae, right? Algebraic formulae, without the discourse you need in prose, etc., to discuss these things. What's your sort of sense of, because Indians clearly had a good foundation in science, just like the Chinese, right, and others, but there seems to be like a slip that happened, and what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the interpretation that the that Indians in the early 19th century, in the early 1800s, their view is that there's sort of two sets of things that are missing in the Indian context, that have retarded sort of the progress of the sciences. The one is, I think it's language is tied into it, but it's not the principal concern for them. It's, as you had said, it's the method. The science,
The medium, right?
yeah, Europe has basically discovered that it's not just ad hoc experimentation. It's the classical sort of texts that are dealing with science are full of all sorts of observational aspects about the sciences, about the constellations. For example, Madhava Rao is deeply interested in Hindu astronomy, not astrology, but astronomy, and he thinks there's a great deal to be learned from it, and that's one of the things often even today when people express pride in the past, they will turn to things like those achievements. And Madhava Rao says, yes, these are really wonderful achievements. He writes books defending and promoting Hindu astronomy, but he says, these are observational elements, and not so much experimental. It's that method of constantly tweaking, toying, trying to innovate and improvise, not in trying to codify and then concretize, remember the names of the constellations, know where the constellations are placed, be able to identify them on a cloudy day or whatever. Those sorts of scientific challenges, which have religious and theological or other political purposes or social purposes, because you use your knowledge of the sciences or the stars or natural phenomena to help you control society. He thinks that's where science has gone wrong. It's been focused too much on that, and what needs to return and or be revitalized is this experimental side. But he thinks, and that's the second major break, that it can't be a hereditary profession or tradition, that this sort of idea of sort of Brahmins passing, and it's not just about caste, it's about the structure, that there are families that have particular chapters or particular parts of the Vedas memorized and will pass it down, or will use their astronomical knowledge and astrological knowledge to guide public events and so on. For him, this is not how science is done, and it's this recognition or admiration for the modern university, which is where all of these figures find themselves. They realize that what the university allows you to do is not just have experimentation, but for it to occur in an our language today, an ecosystem, in their world, a sort of a universe where you make propositions, you provide evidence, and others can challenge it and change it. And so they're reading their Locke's, and they're reading a Newton, they're seeing where the change from Galileo is, then they're reading a Locke, then they're reading sort of contemporary late 18th and early 19th century scientists who are undertaking experiments in chemistry and physics and biology. For Madhava Rao, for instance, he's absolutely fascinated by physics. His area of specialization is mathematics, and the teacher E.B. Powell, who has such a great impact on him, is also a sort of a prime is a wrangler, is a prime mathematician, and they study the stars. They create these homemade telescopes. Powell gets a telescope brought in very expensive from London, and they use it to study the stars. And Madhava Rao says, "Look, now I can explain to people solar eclipses are not caused by, I can predict, the solar eclipses are not caused by some theological phenomena or a promise or God's sanction or retribution, or these are not signs of ancient myths coming to life, but these are natural processes." And so this happens because a person like exists in a universe where he's in Cambridge and being taught and being asked to interrogate things. He lives in a city like London where he can purchase astronomical equipment from science shops. And that's the world that Indians need to create. So they both need to change how they think, but they also need the institutions to support scientific thinking. That's the objective.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think this makes me think of Joel Moky's book on the gifts of Athena, right? Where Joel Moky, the economic historian, and he kind of speaks about this idea of useful knowledge, right? It's because he says, look, everyone knew that, people were doing some form of inoculation up, here and there, and they knew that, oh, okay, if you take something from a sick patient and transfer it, you kind of get some vaccination effect, but you really have general kind of standardized scale that process. And so I think what seems to come across is that clearly, the Indians have a scientific tradition, but there is this transmission into useful knowledge that is not really kicking off. A bit like the Germans also and the French, right? The French are extremely good mathematicians, but then you still have the Industrial Revolution in England, and so it's I think a fascinating time to also sort of understand what gaps are there, how people perceive those gaps, and how they try to overcome those gaps, and which sort of let's move on to the next topic, I think, which is again super relevant, which is free trade and tariffs, right? This is all over the news today. Tariffs are back in vogue, and you kind of hear again in India, you have like you have these two strains. But in India, actually, you have one major strain that basically says, the Brits essentially came and looted, and you think of, some kind of, I don't know, Mongol or Han invasion, and people are cutting people's heads and grabbing stuff. And it's, of course, there might have been a bit of that at the start when the company was around, but that's not how you can actually rule over such a large area over 250 years. So clearly, there was a lot more sophistication than that. And I think tariffs come across and as really a key tool in with which they did that, and Indians very quickly figured out that was happening. And so you write about how there were metric tariffs between Britain on one hand and and British India and Indian goods on the other. And so any Indian businessman trying to export their goods to Britain would pay a tariff between 30 and 80%. Any British businessmen exporting their goods to India is paying a tariff between 0 and 5%. And so this kind of, over time, logically, of course, will lead to Indian deindustrialization. And so you don't have to go and, there are these stories of artisans' hands being cut off. But I mean, that is not scale, right? I'm sure there was some of that brutality, but it couldn't have been just that. So it's a certain sophistication around trade policy that allowed that kind of resulted in massive deindustrialization more than just violence, right? And Indians quickly figure that out. They're writing about it. And to just put some numbers, right? You write in 1813, India is exporting 2 million pounds of cotton products to England. And I think cotton is important because that was sort of the main the sort of the main kind of valuable product at that point. And so in 1813, India is exporting 2 million pounds, and by 1858, India is importing 11 million pounds from England. And so asymmetric tariff can have a huge effect. And Bola Nath Chandra, I quote him here because it's such a powerful quote. It says, "To strip naked the disguised truth, the English want to reduce us all to the condition of agriculturists. They are afraid of the consequences of intelligence and wealth in our nation, hence the fashion to cry us down into an agricultural people." And so, I mean, there are these crazy tariffs. The Indians are aware and they are debating this. So do you want to sort of unpack the Indian views on trade and tariffs, the understanding, and perhaps draw any parallels to today?
Yeah, thanks. It's another sort of big question. You know, the I sometimes joke the British tariff policy was make Britain great again and again. So they just constantly kind of tweak the policy. Every time Indians try to work their way around the policy, they would tweak it to further tighten the screws. And I think the story again is more complicated than people would like to make it seem. It's not the case that Britain just simply smashed and grabbed, exactly as you said. They invested in some very important ventures. From simple things like rolling out vaccination strategies, which really significantly helped reduce the incidence of preventable disease, caring about, even if they did it slowly and they did it nowhere near the level they should have, they cared about things like sanitation, the building of railways or roads, the laying down of telegraph networks that connects Indians up to news and information in Europe and allows Indians to start thinking about um, international trade and opportunities. And most importantly, allowing Indians to study and travel, study in Europe, or building European style universities in India, which introduce European science and commercial ideas into India. So the British are not simply smashing and grabbing; they're making these kinds of investments. Of course, one can take the cynical view that they're trying to buy time. They will make these investments. There's all this hand wringing while the investments are being made, like when English is being taught or universities are being set up. There are plenty of people in parliament who say this is going to create a problem for us 60 years from now. These people are going to turn around. They're going to be better traders, better debaters, better strategists than us if we give them all this education and arm them and equip them with modern knowledge. And there are others, including figures like Macaulay, who say, no, well, um, there is no other way. Literally, as you were saying, there is no other way for us to hold this empire. The only way to hold it is to have those who think what we're doing is worthwhile, that there's at least some upside to the story. So you get British investments, but at the same time, there is a clear, very sort of laser clear idea of how India is to be made use of. We've already talked about one part of it, which is India can provide troops and money to help the British Empire expand. That's a very large part of the story, and what becomes the early Congress critique of Britain. One part of that critique is you're taxing us and using the money for your imperial projects. So don't tax India for wars in Egypt, Iraq, Myanmar, or Burma at that time, or Tibet, etc. But the other one is don't make your industrial policy such that we are deindustrialized. So most people, when they think back to the colonial period, they will immediately latch onto the drain theory. So the idea that the British were paying their own officers generously or handsomely, that they were uh, messing around with foreign exchange rates such that there was a sort of unfavorable exchange rate for India, and Indians would um, Indians would never really have control. They couldn't deploy their surpluses, like our reserves, as we would call them today, our foreign exchange reserves, in any meaningful way. The reserves sat in London and were used by the British for their own benefit. So we would focus that drain theory and that approach of colonialism as extraction gives us a limited view. The extraction is also occurring, as the Congress leaders like Ranade and others realize later. It's also occurring through a lack of protection of Indian industry. It's not just extraction, it's exposing it to international competition in an unbalanced way. So it leaves us, unfortunately, with a very, when we think back to colonialism, it leaves us with this very incomplete account on the economic side. One, we don't see or we don't recognize enough, or praise might be too strong a word, at least give credit for the things that the British do, like building universities. And we tend to only focus on the more brutal, as you were saying, the more obvious forms, the more visible and violent forms of extraction. And we don't think enough about how they actually deindustrialized India. That it means that Indians were actually more capable and adaptable to economic competition had they been allowed to. So
Correct.
it's not that the international Indians don't know how to compete on the international economic system, and they just got trampled by the British.
And it's not as if you had a golden age of industry and then you come and smash everything. It was, despite, the challenge, they were trying to build back,
Exactly.
right? They're constantly Indian industrialists trying to build stuff. So I think that story of sort of fight learning and sort of, getting back up on your feet, I think is really inspiring and amazing. And that comes across.
Yeah, so it's the point I'm trying to make is that there was a lot more kneecapping. We tend to think of it as theft, but that wasn't the more obvious problem. The more to Indians living at that time, the more obvious problem was, yeah, of course, the colonial power is gonna, Madhava Rao says, don't expect the British to govern us and provide things like roads and defense without wanting a payoff, without wanting their share, their lion's share. That's not the problem for us as much as, which is why he didn't agree with Adhava Naoroji. His problem was, look, give us fair terms of trade. So you can keep taking your 15, 20% off the GDP, but allow us to at least stand up and compete internationally. And so that's one of the things, like in all the princely states, that's what he tried to do. And other far-sighted divans tried to do, was to start local industry. And they could do it there because they were not as much under the thumb of the British as Indians living in Bombay or Calcutta or Delhi.
And I think a lot of people don't realize, like in the contemporary setting, when you have unilateral tariffs being put on India by the US for right now, these wounds go deep, right? This is not like, oh, let me put a tariff on whoever I want. This is my style. People did that. People did that for centuries, like for at least a century and a half. And so I think in foreign, especially when it comes to foreign policy, I think it's important for countries to be cognizant of this past, so that it's not just symbolic, it's not just contemporary. This is cultural and much deeper. And there's a certain awareness within India where people are writing about this in the early 1800s, like mid 1800s. And so I think the tariff question is so important, and the commitment to free trade is also interesting, because what comes across very clearly is Indians don't have a problem with free trade.
Exactly.
They have a problem when the terms are not fair. And it's very interesting how, comparing this to China, and how China sort of managed its way into the WTO and beyond. Doug Guthrie was telling me on the pod, how initially you would ask for technology transfer. So you only give access to the Chinese market pre-WTO. Once they were in the WTO, you're not allowed to do that anymore. And then Patrick McGee, in his book Apple in China, has written about how essentially the Chinese passed regulation where by default you would actually be sort of not following the laws. And the reason was they couldn't ask you for something, but if you went and offered it, they would say, okay, since you're offering, we'll take it. So you're not in breach of WTO, and you still get what you want. So you still have leverage over a foreign company. And I think I get a feeling like Indians are not into that kind of game. They're not into these rough tackles. They're much more like, okay, look, let's set the playing field straight, free trade, etc. We're totally on board, and then we do it. And we tend to, in that sense, I guess, you tend to kind of see this mindset of, look, give us the playing field and let us play, instead of, okay, we will get dirty if needed, right, in tackling. Is that a fair sort of?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think, you require a highly capable state and a highly efficient, effective state that can very carefully manage incentives, but also deliver on its promises. Then you can make the kind of quid pro quo deals that China was able to make with foreign investors, regardless of what the WTO may have allowed or not allowed. But you could basically get a promise at the municipality level, or even at the provincial level, that if you invest X amount and share Y amount of knowledge with us, we will deliver A, B, and C. And it was delivered. And there was that sort of credibility and promise. You will have a port, you will have electricity, we will provide you with people. There won't be labor problems. There won't be, there won't be a competitor allowed for 5 years. That sort of stuff.
Well, my feeling is the Indians don't think like that anyway, even back then, right? They believe that this is unfair, this is wrong, this is not the way you run stuff, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's got a lot to do with, this sort of goes back to a question you'd asked earlier about the nature of Indian sort of awakening to the modern world. And it is highly individualistic. I often, when I give lectures, I sort of say that the Chinese approached modernity as with the state leading the state. So you expect you ask who's in charge, and there's an official brought in front of you, and that official makes a decision. India's modernity occurred in the drawing room, in many different houses, completely in this unstructured, chaotic, one by one, area by area, city by city approach. Bombay in 1860 is as far from, the hinterlands or from the Mufassal as London is. I mean, they don't even understand what these people are saying, doing, the language, the modes, the way they're dressing, the food they eat, the way they conduct themselves. Bombay has just drifted away. It's just doing its own thing, like Calcutta, like Madras.
Yeah, it's less homogeneous, right? It's less this kind of standardized, sort of.
Yeah, so in
Um,
a way, I guess the way another way to put it is Indian modernity is not state; it's society led, not state led. And what that means is that when you encounter things like markets, people just sort of want to shoot off in their own direction. Some people want to trade labor. Some people want to become indentured laborers and go off to Fiji. Some people want to try and start a business. Some people want to inherit the family business, and others don't want to inherit it, and they want to make a fresh start. Their fathers have been farmers, but they want to be clerks or whatever it might be. So
that's where the resilience probably comes from, right? From this decentral bottom-up kind of structure also.
absolutely. I mean, if in China, if anything happens to the party, China's in turmoil. In India, if anything happens to
Mhm.
any one political party or even to the state, makes no difference at the end of the day because the rootedness of our transformation is social. It's not complete by any stretch of the imagination. It's not pretty, it's not perfect, but it's very widely spread. And this is what people fail to understand. And when you only understand that if you take the very long view, if you take this 200, 250-year view, and you start to see people basically standing up on their own 2 feet saying, I will learn English. I mean, no one's forcing you. There's no state that's giving you a subsidy to learn it. You say, I'm going to learn English. And a parent says, I'm only going to eat one meal a day so that I can pay a tutor to teach my child English so that they can start.
And that still happens today,
Yeah,
right? I think it still happens today in families. And the interesting thing, and you write about some of these characters, but like you write about Anandi Bai Joshi was the first Indian lady, along with I forget there was two Indian ladies who were the first Western educated medical doctors to graduate in the United States. Um, and you see their evolution and how when they're traveling and they see Native Americans on reservations, their reaction to the brutality of that. And then you also have the interesting example of Krishna Dan Ghosh, who's a surgeon in the civil service, and his evolution from being an Anglophile to then him writing to his son, Aurobindo Ghosh, while he's in Cambridge, saying, "Look, this system is rigged," and all of that, right? They're not, and so you see this interesting evolution of people, right, who come out of the same system, but who kind of and thinking with it. I mean, you spoke of indentured labor, which brings us to the next important topic, which is racism and the diaspora in general, right? So this, like, how, you see this, indentured laborers start taking off out of India once slavery is banned. And I think you have to give credit to the British for banning it pretty early. But then, you still need cheap labor and indentured laborers because India's kind of been deindustrialized systematically. You have a lot of agricultural labor that is open to go abroad, and they still end up earning 2 to 3 times the domestic wage. And I think that's what makes it attractive, that wage differential. And then the question is, okay, is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? And you have someone like Rana Day then writing, if the old thraldom of prejudice and easy self-satisfaction and patient resignation is ever to be loosened, and new aspirations and hopes created in their place, a change of home surroundings is a standing necessity and preparatory discipline. And I think this is something that's so true about the diaspora today. And I think it's something I just tell anyone who asks me what's a good experience to have, is just go to a new country, right? Start from zero, and then it just gives you perspective. And it's so fascinating to see someone write that 150, 200 years ago.
yeah,
And you also see then Indians writing about the diaspora in South Africa. I mean, everyone speaks about Gandhi in India, but like, it's interesting what he was doing in South Africa earlier. And so, like, what do you want to speak a bit about, like, Indian views on the racism they faced, and also the care for the diaspora, because you spoke of Indian the peacekeeping force in Sri Lanka, and I think that was, again, it's the Tamil it's the Tamil diaspora in Sri Lanka. And so like, can you unpack that a bit? Like, what are Indian views on racism and on the diaspora then, and what are the parallels today?
Yeah, thanks. That great question. And with in all these in the questions you've asked and in the answers I've tried to give, I always want to make us think twice about the things that we take for granted or things we seem certain about. So, the reason I reprinted that very, very important essay by Ranade, who, when he writes it, he is by far and away the most prominent Indian liberal. He's, a judge on the Bombay High Court. He's one of the most accomplished people of his generation, and he's giving the lecture before the Industrial Manufacturers Association. It's the body of absolutely the most privileged in that sense, and he's telling them migration and even indentured migration is good. And the reason I publish that is because it makes us stop and rethink how we view the indentured system. We have this uniformly negative view of it. And even I did when I was younger. I thought it was this sort of, slavery by another name.
Pseudo slavery, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. And he, marshals all these facts. And then, of course, when you read him, then you start reading others around him and you realize he's by no means is he alone. There are people that indenture themselves. They repeat the contracts two, three, four times before they're able to settle down permanently in these other locations. Partly the climate is better, partly they're offered better deals. If you complete your indenture, you actually get a couple of acres of land and you can basically become a permanent resident. You're still a citizen of the broader British Empire. These are, again, don't get me wrong, by no means would one want someone to be treated like this in the ideal. But in an unideal world where you could starve in Bihar or you could starve instead you could go to Mauritius or you could go to Fiji, it made sense. Rationally, Rana Day is telling us it makes sense for these people. They're making a good, rational decision. Even if we don't like it or don't like the racism they encounter, that was one of the big concerns when he gives this speech. Racism has started being reported, and there are attempts to try and limit migration. But the idea is less the concern is for the migrants themselves as much as threatening the British. If we don't send you migrants, your economy overseas, your plantation economies will collapse. So treat us well here, and then we'll allow you to keep having migrants. So it's a way to politicize the migrant issue. And he's pushing back and saying, hang on a second, you're actually playing with real people's lives, real people's decisions. And these are important because they're rational for them. They actually save, and it improves their circumstances, which are they're starting on a terrible baseline. But it actually also improves our society. It's not just these individuals that are improving, because it shakes up our ideas. As you were saying, it makes us, these indentured workers go away, they meet others, they travel on these ships, they realize that travel overseas is not polluting, it doesn't ruin them, it doesn't, they come back at least somewhat wealthier than they were when they left. They're able to marry better, they're able to invest in their children and get them education, so there's upward mobility. Women are able to work. Brahmins are able to work. They're able to take on professions they can't within India. So Ranade says this is a big win for us in that sense. It's not perfect, but it's an improvement. So it's important to see that because it changes how we view the historical story. Emigration was nothing other than slavery and racism. It was terrible and how awful the British were. No, actually, ironically, against their intentions, against their plans, once more, Indians were able to turn what looked like a painful imposition on them into their advantage. They educated, saved, expanded their horizons, and settled in new places. So, once more,
And
yeah,
Yeah, and I think Ranade was so right. Like I can just like last year I was for my very close friend's wedding in Mauritius, and he's Creole, but like Mauritius essentially dominated by the Indian diaspora, right? Like the entire politics, everything. And we just stopped on the roadside for like a coffee or something, and speaking to the roadside store owner. He's so much more well off. He has relatives, from his village of origin in Bihar, and he still goes back. He helps them financially. And he said, I'm so glad my forefathers moved here because I just have a better life. And if you look at it, it's not like he was driving a Porsche or something or a Ferrari, but whatever, he still felt he was in a stable place. He had a comfortable life, and he cherished that. And so I think Ranat in so many ways was right. You just have to go and see, live that, and meet people today to see that.
exactly, absolutely. That's precisely right. And then if you flip, so you'd ask me on the other side, sort of if you think about emigration and the diaspora today, the fundamental difference with the diaspora today and as it was back then earlier, the predominant diaspora, the one that Ranade is writing about, were people for whom emigration was sort of life enhancing, opportunity enhancing. And though they worked, it was primarily manual labor, they were being supplanted, or they were being replaced by white collar emigration. So people that were educated or able to perform at least basic service tasks. So clerks, low level officers in a bank, low level officers in a clinic or in a hospital, sort of nurses and orderlies, that kind of thing, policemen working at the beat level, and so on. So already by the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, you can start to see a new kind of immigration, and those immigrants have a very different experience with immigration. And it's a lot more like what we are seeing with immigration today, because they are a threat to the local population. They're actually challenging, supplanting, replacing the local population. So the reason why immigration in Fiji or Guyana is so different from immigration to Natal is because their Indians are actually wealthier, better educated, and demanding a share in public life. They want to be allowed to vote when they settle down, when they own a sufficient piece of land. The bar keeps being raised, and Indians keep jumping over the bar. So it's, you have to have 5 rupee, 5 shillings, then 10, then 15, then 20, and Indians keep meeting the bar, and this frustrates uh, the dominant sort of white population. And so what we are seeing is that story which really starts. So by the 1920s and 30s, almost every European jurisdiction in the colonies bars Indian migration. That's when we start to get these Asiatic control, because the Indians and the Japanese are far fewer in number. It's primarily Indians and Chinese that are turning up in these places, and because of their thrift, their willingness to work hard, their strong sort of communal and social values. They work in these cohesive units, they help each other, they provide loans and assistance.
A bit like the Jewish communities too, right,
Yeah,
around Europe and elsewhere,
absolutely,
right?
absolutely. 25 years ago, I wrote one of the first op-eds I ever wrote was called "The New Jews," and it was an account of how Indian migration had finally restarted after having been stopped in the 1920s. It had restarted, and this op-ed was written in 2000, but it summarized what had happened over the last decade, over the 1990s, where there had been this substantial change. And my worry then, which I think is coming true now, is that this is what happens to migrant communities when they're successful and hardworking. Indian history tells us what happens. They become targets.
And I think if they don't integrate more than just be successful financially, and I think when people then disrespect local customs, and I think then the pushback is much harder. There's this Indian term, nazar na lage. I always thought it meant be shy, kind of hide yourself type of thing, but actually what it means is be respectful of your environment so you don't stand out. You're not a sore thumb. And I think that is something that then has a lot of pushback, right? If you start doing all kinds of dances and block roads, or I don't know, this type of thing, people bringing cows into their homes in cities, and there are enough stories of that. But to wrap up, I think we're running low on time, and I think we've not been able to discuss your other book on Madhavarao. I hope we can do another session at some point, because I think it deserves an hour. It's not something that can be sped through. But to wrap up this discussion, and again, the book is To Raise a Fallen People. It's a fascinating set of essays. But I think the big question here that I want to ask you to wrap up is what can the world learn from India, right? And there's been this sort of trend, as you point out aptly in your book, because of the Orientalists trying to get their funding academically, that India is just sort of like a source of, I don't know, yoga and spirituality and lifestyle and Ayurveda, in a very hip sort of woke sense. But I think there's a lot more to that. And so can would you like to unpack in a very fundamental civilizational sense, what can the world learn from India today?
I think it's actually conservatism, but with a small c. And I mean that in the philosophical, intellectual sense, not in the social or religious sense. What I mean by that is, for hundreds of years, quite apart from the thousands of years of our broader civilization, but for from the rise of this early modernity in India in the 1800s, there is a great deal of doubt and skepticism about projecting power and about trying to remake the world outside. It's not that the world outside is terrible and evil. It isn't a view like the Great Wall view that the world outside is barbaric and we need to just basically preserve ourselves from it. Indians have had, particularly on the coasts, had a very open sort of approach to trade, to engagement, to exchange, to migrants, to or migration, and so on. And so there's a distinctive history that feeds into a kind of for a country that has an ocean named after it, a kind of openness and engagement with communities and the broader world. But at almost no point has there been an attempt to remake those worlds, to conquer them, to command them, to reshape them, to exterminate them. And there is a great beauty to that. And I mean, I think one of the reasons why people will often turn to a Vivekananda and cite him as this sort of very obvious, only too obvious a figure. But I think the one really striking thing about Vivekananda is that when he returns from these travels, he comes back and he's recounting this meeting in London where a young woman says to him, why should we care about the Indians? They've done nothing great. They're just sitting in their country, doing their thing, fighting over kind of minutiae that don't really make sense to anyone else, and self-interested, self-obsessed, self-curious, and that's it. And Vivekananda says, well, that's precisely why we're great. We're great because we've not cared too much about trying to change or do anything to anyone else. We're great because we spent our time thinking, living, and reproducing, not in the biological sense, but in the sense of having a civilization that's an ongoing thing. And that's our greatness. And he comes home absolutely convinced of this idea. It takes him a while to kind of, he oscillates between a couple of different options, and then he comes back, and this is his takeaway. And it does have this slight flavor of Orientalism to it, like we're exotic or unique or different or distinct. But I think he does get, like with every summary we give of of any large civilization, we're going to miss nuance with any phrase. But this idea that there is greatness to be had by focusing on getting things right at home, by not by trying to dominate others, not by putting them down, and not by using force or conquest. There is something valuable and right in that, and it ultimately comes down to a civilization, particularly Hindu heritage, that is tolerant. I mean, that's the point that again and again Vivekananda makes. We just simply don't want to change the world. We don't believe in fire and sword. And that is the thing. I don't think the world will ever learn it from us. I think it's, for better or for worse, it's only our inheritance. Maybe the only other, I just don't, I don't see others trending their civilization in that direction. But that's our great strength. We have not tried to really twist.
I think this is catching on, right? I think, yeah, you put it beautifully. And to sort of wrap it up, my favorite French rapper, just to paraphrase him, he says, when you're young, you try to change the world, and as you mature, you try to change yourself. And on that note, I think that's really that's what I think the world can learn from India, and might be actually good to learn.
Great.
You can't change the world. All you can do is try to change yourself.
Yeah, yeah. If you think,
On that note, thank you so much, Rahul. It was a wonderful discussion. I hope to have you back to unpack your other book.
thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, Ritavan. Great pleasure. Thank you.